Hello, I'm Susan Olenwine, and I'm on the piano faculty for the Center of Musical Arts, which is part of the Colorado Music Festival. I have been asked to talk to you about the Tchaikovsky Piano Concerto, which will be performed on July 28th and 29th by Venezuelan pianist Gabriela Montero. Tchaikovsky's piano concerto was considered unplayable when it was first composed. That was also said of his violin concerto, but both are part of the standard repertoire and are performed even by very young musicians. The concerto gained great fame in 1958 thanks to Van Cliburn's winning of the Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow. This was during the height of the Cold War and was such a sensational accomplishment by an American pianist that he was given a ticker tape parade in New York City. Times have changed. We don't even know when the competitions are held anymore. We're not paying attention like we used to. But I would like to recommend this book about this particular competition, Van Cliburn, and the politics that were going on during the time of the competition and the Cold War. It's extremely interesting, the clash between the United States and America in the theater of the arts, not just politics, and you will gain much from reading that. But that's all I'm going to say about the concerto. I am going to talk more about Gabriela, who will perform the Tchaikovsky, but also about her unique ability to improvise. Usually at the end of her concerto performance, she asks the audience for a simple and popular tune and then proceeds to improvise on it. Hers is a rare skill, and very few pianists can do this. But with that in mind, I wanted to give you a little bit of history on the subject of improvisation to give you a better understanding of what's going on. The definition of improvisation is spontaneous creation of a composition or the unrehearsed modification in the moment of performance. It can occur with a single musician or several. While we mostly associate improvisation with jazz, it does have a history dating back to the 13th century in Western music. It's also a feature of Asian, African, Middle Eastern, and Eastern European cultures. But let's go back a few centuries and discover how improvisation was featured. We find it first in vocal music with Gregorian chants. While some of the singers may have been sustaining long tones, another singer proceeded to improvise with long florid passages, which we call melismas. In 14th century secular France, the improvisation moved to the part of the accompaniment, which would have been the lute or guitar. And the improvisation was allowed to happen as long as it did not get into the way of the singer. Improvisation was an essential part of Baroque music. The keyboard at the time was the harpsichord, and usually the only music that was provided to the harpsichordist was a single bass line, which was also the cello line. Underneath that line were a series of numbers which explained how to build the harmonies above that single note. So the harpsichordist then would look at those and provide a harmonic outline or melodic improvisation underneath a violin or a flute sonata, perhaps. In the solo keyboard realm, the same line could be given and the performer would simply extemporize both the harmonies and melodies and ornamentations and variations and so on and so forth. So improvisation was a prominent feature for keyboard music during the Baroque period. So from the Baroque period through the classical period, so we're talking 1660 to 1800 or so, composers were called upon in performance to improvise. They would probably perform their own works, and then the audience would ask them to improvise either on one of their own tunes or select another popular tune. They would improvise usually in the style of their own compositions, which pretty much would have been classical or early romanticism if we're talking about Beethoven. Chopin, Liszt, and Paganini also improvised, but also in their styles. The practice was lost during the Romantic period when the compositions became so complex that it was difficult for musicians to improvise on the current musical language. Another place where improvisation was very important was in the cadenzas of a concerto. So what happens in a concerto is the orchestra and the pianist or instrumentalist are playing the composed music. At a certain point, the orchestra stops and the soloist is called upon to improvise on the theme, basically. That was part of the movement. Now, in the time of Beethoven and Mozart, those performers improvised their own cadenzas. But then after a while, their contemporaries began to compose cadenzas for specific concerti. So if you really want to impress a pianist who is performing a Mozart or a Beethoven concerto, ask them, whose cadenza are you going to be using? Because there are many to select from. In our current history, more and more pianists are beginning to offer their own improvisations. The most unique one that I ever heard was several years ago with the Boulder Phil and jazz pianist Marcus Roberts, who played a Mozart concerto. And when he got to the cadenza, his improvisation was in the jazz style and not in the classical style. It was really a very unique juxtaposition of the two styles and the two art forms. So there still are places where we require improvisation from the pianist in certain situations. In the performance of a Mozart opera, there is a recitative, and usually a harpsichordist is given a single chord and has to improvise underneath the text. And his improvisation or her improvisation should be supporting what's happening in the action, supporting the text, creating the scene, and helping the singer move from the recitative into the next aria with an understanding of what's happening in the opera. Organists are really well known for their ability to improvise because they have to be able to provide continued musical background during a ritual. So, for instance, if a communion service is taking a little bit longer than expected, the organist has to improvise in a very sensible and sensitive way to underscore what is going on during the service. And even though this is no longer current, we have to acknowledge the pianists and the organists, theater organists, during the time of silent films. They were literally sitting at their instrument, watching the film and the action and improvising to provide the music, which now, of course, is composed and scores, but they were just doing it on the spot. Very remarkable feat. But now let's move on to Gabriela Montero, our guest artist. She was born with, as she puts it, a specific neurology and the ability to improvise. She says it's a blessing as well as a burden and that she has no choice. She's got a 24-hour radio spinning around in her brain all the time. She also describes herself as having two brains, one for improvisation and one for her classical training and performance. She began to play when she was only about 7 months old. She was given a toy piano that was put in her crib, and she began to mimic the lullabies that her mother sang to her and the other music that was surrounding her. She lived in an apartment building in Caracas, Venezuela, where one of the most important and prominent piano teachers also lived. So she got training at a very early age. And by the time she was 8, she was performing with orchestras. When she is doing her improvisation, what will happen, this is what to expect. She will ask the audience for a simple tune. She will play it, and then you will see her pause as she's beginning to process. I think she is trying to understand the harmonic implications and the melody and what she can do with it. So in her last performance here in Colorado, in Boulder, the tune that was given to her was Blue Moon. And fortunately, she has lived in America enough to know this tune. Pretty remarkable, I think. However, there's great emotion in what she is doing, and she enjoys what she calls a state of flow. She will move, she might start with a Baroque polyphonic style and then move into classical, romantic, impressionism, ragtime, blues, whatever happens. Or she might take the theme and only improvise in the style of one composer, such as Rachmaninoff, which is very recognizable. She never knows what will happen. There's no plan. It really, truly is absolutely spontaneous. And we get to enjoy this remarkable experience. I cannot fathom how this happens, and we can't fathom the magic that is happening in present time, and that we are witnessing a brand new composition that will never be performed again exactly the same way. So in preparation for Gabriela's performances, I highly recommend visiting YouTube, type in Gabriela Montero Improvisation, and you will see a whole list to watch. And if you really want to get to know her better, her history, the scientific studies that have been done on her brain, and her very important and intense involvement with Venezuelan politics, I recommend looking for the Harvard Radcliffe Institute interview with Gabriela, and her husband is actually the moderator. You will learn so much about improvisation and about Gabriela, and I hope you will enjoy that. So we'll see you July 28th and or 29th, and certainly many, many of the other performances that precede Gabriela's performance. Thank you. See you there.